So that consumer choice issue was thrust to centre stage as well. It wasn't only the consumers, of course, it was organic farmers who said that their values didn't allow them to take this particularly big step, and I think it is a big step, which then raised a whole load of ethical concerns, because selective breeding of plants, which sometimes GM proponents compare this to in terms of traditional methods of honing over a period of time through breeding plants to bring out certain traits, I think this is qualitatively different in taking genes between species and moving them into crop plants. And some people, for ethical reasons, you may disagree with it, they took the view that actually that was too far and that this was not an acceptable thing, that they didn't want to buy into, and therefore they didn't want to eat it. And so what do you do in terms of segregation and separating, even if you do go ahead with this, especially if the pollen is blowing around the countryside? So these were the kinds of things that were on the table, and of course at the time there was also a big discussion around the role of the private sector and the extent to which this, although it was being claimed that it would feed the world, it would help to protect the environment, it would give farmers more choice, it would help consumer choice and make food cheaper. All these claims were being made, and some of us were thinking, actually, let's have a look behind the scenes here in terms of the business model. And the business model, I felt and still feel, wasn't geared up to those things. It was first and foremost geared to commercial profit through the industrialisation of farming and through the capturing of economic value through patents. That's what it was all about and remains to be all about today. There's really two traits out there. Herbicide tolerance and insect resistance are the two things that are still being grown on a large scale worldwide. Both of these things are patented in order to earn vast shareholder dividends for the companies who own the intellectual property on those crops. And in the case of the glyphosate resistant soya and maize, it was very clear that Monsanto, coming to the end of the life of the patent on that particular pesticide, had instead switched the patent into the plant rather than the chemical, and was selling vast amounts of chemicals through the protection of the IPR in the plant. That was the business model. Now, some of us felt that this actually was a bit disingenuous, let's say, in terms of some of the claims being made, and we had a campaign about this. And as the campaign intensified, people said, well, let's have science-based policy. And I said, absolutely wonderful, let's have science-based policy. So we asked the companies to provide us with the science, and they said it's commercially confidential. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the scientific method is about peer review, about scrutiny, about criticism, and about testing data. And the only way we could get this stuff in the end was through use of legal actions, including a rather little-known UK law whereby you have to get permission to put seeds on the national seed list. And we used this in order to open up the data, in order that we could scrutinise it. And we found all sorts of things that we felt were at best over-claims in terms of what the companies were saying. So since then, the conversation about sustainable agriculture has continued. And I think we've shed more light now on the nature of what truly could be sustainable farming. And one of the policy discussions that I think is most important, was published in 2008, was the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development, which was chaired by our own Bob Watson, who's now the chief scientist at DEFRA, which came to the conclusion that far from seeking to industrialise farming even more in the 21st century, real food security could be gained through the promotion of traditional methods, farmer training, soil conservation, and reduced inputs, which would enable farmers to be resilient in this global market where energy prices go up and down and chemical prices go up and down too, and also to be growing more for local markets and thereby keeping farmers on the land and not being pushed off of the land because of the forces of economic globalisation. Now, the GM crop industry, that was a 400-strong scientists intensive report. It didn't reach the conclusion that we should go hell for leather for GMOs, and the GM industry walked away from that. And I thought, well, so much for science. This was a scientific process, and they didn't get the conclusion they liked, so they walked away from it. And I would encourage people to go to the website of the International Assessment, the IAA STD, have a look at the conclusions there and see what you think, because even if you disagree with it, it's an important part of the debate going forward in terms of how we might be able to feed 9 billion people on the agricultural land that we have. Now, my final point really is about the agricultural land. And I think instead of looking at technology, the conclusion I've reached over many, many years of thinking about this is that the real resource we have in the world that we have to husband is soil. And I think this is where we need to be putting our effort in the years ahead to make sure that the soils we have are sustained and that the soils we've degraded are rebuilt. Now, would you believe that something like 30% of the agricultural soils under tillage in the world today have been degraded since the mid-20th century, at the same time the population has been increasing? And not only is this an issue for food security, there's something like 50 to 70% of the organic soil carbon has been released into the atmosphere at the same time, which is a huge impact on the climate change agenda as well. And there's so many synergies to be gained by focusing on soils through traditional methods that I think that's where the policy agenda now needs to go in terms of farmer training, subsidies and the policy debate. And yes, you know, we can use technology and harness it, but I think an integrated approach, looking at the whole cycle of how food is grown and how that can have an impact on development is where we need to go. And simply assuming, as some people were claiming 12 years ago, it's moved on, I acknowledge that by introducing these high-tech methods we could end poverty and end hunger, it simply doesn't add up. And on the soil carbon point, just finally, you know, this I think is possibly one of the biggest opportunities we have worldwide in terms of being able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. The Rodale Institute in the United States is saying that 40% of emissions could be sequestered in soils going forward if we move back towards more traditional methods that have high organic content in the soils, and that at the same time we'd be more resilient to the impacts of climate change through the enhanced water retention that you'd get through those more traditional treatments of soils. And the other thing, of course, I think we have to do is to be rebuilding soils worldwide through terracing, through more traditional tillage methods so that we can improve food security in that way. So those are my broad remarks. You know, the critique, I think, largely remains. I'm not against technology, I'm certainly not against development, but I'm interested in the most effective ways of harnessing technology so that we can ensure food security, not just this year and next year, but into the 22nd century as well. Thank you.